Hi, I'm Joe Tiberio from the IRS Employment Tax Program in the Small Business Self-Employed Division in Washington, D.C. I'd like to welcome everyone to our webinar today entitled Payments to Independent Contractors. This webinar is designed for small business owners, tax practitioners, and other stakeholders to give you the basic information needed to properly report payments to independent contractors, Form 1099 miscellaneous filing requirements, backup withholding and how to avoid being liable for it, and CP2100 backup withholding notices for payee name and taxpayer identification number or mismatches. I hope you'll find this presentation both helpful and informative. This program will be archived on our website, irs.gov, for later viewing. We would also like to extend a welcome to any participants representing the news media. If you are with the media, please send us a message at sbse.webinars@irs.gov with your contact information. Our media relations staff can answer any questions you might have following the presentation. You can ask questions during the webinar by clicking the Ask a Question link under the PowerPoint window and hitting the Submit button. At the end of the presentation, Senior Policy Analyst Ed Hutzman from Employment Tax will join me to help respond to your questions. Given the time constraints of this webinar, we can only answer general questions related to the topic and information presented today. We request that you not ask taxpayer-specific questions, as we simply don't have the resources and access to the information needed to respond appropriately. We also ask that when posing a question, you avoid revealing any sensitive or identifying information that might disclose personal and private information about you, your business, your clients, or other parties. We want to be sure to keep personal information confidential. For your convenience, we have provided you with a PDF file of this presentation to download and print. Now let's get started with the presentation. First, I would like to share with you the difference between employees and independent contractors. It is critical that you correctly determine whether the individuals providing services are employees or independent contractors. Generally, you must withhold income taxes, withhold and pay Social Security and Medicare taxes, and pay unemployment taxes on wages paid to an employee. You do not generally have to withhold or pay any taxes on payments to independent contractors. Before you can determine how to treat payments you make for services, you must first know the business relationship that exists between you and the person performing the services. The person performing the services may be an independent contractor. The general rule is that an individual is an independent contractor if the payer has the right to control or direct only the result of the work and not what will be done and how it will be done. The person performing services may be an employee. Under common law rules, anyone who performs services for you is your employee if you can control what will be done and how it will be done. What matters is that you have the right to control the details of how the services are performed. To determine whether the person providing service is an employee or independent contractor, all information that provides evidence of the degree of control and independence must be considered. The common law rules that provide evidence of the degree of control and independence are divided into three categories. One is behavioral. Does the company control or have the right to control what the worker does and how the worker does his or her job? Two is financial. Are the business aspects of the worker's job controlled by the payer? These include things like how is the worker paid, whether expenses are reimbursed, or who provides tools and supplies, etc. Finally, three, the type of relationship. Are there certain contracts or employee-type benefits, such as a pension plan, insurance, vacation pay, etc.? Will the relationship continue, and is the work performed a key aspect of the business? Businesses must weigh all these factors when determining whether a worker is an employee or independent contractor. The keys are to look at the entire relationship, consider the degree or the extent of the right to direct and control, and finally, document each of these factors used in coming up with the determination. If after reviewing the categories of evidence, it is still unclear to you whether a worker is an employee or independent contractor, Form SS-8, Determination of Worker Status, for purposes of federal employment taxes and income tax withholding, can be filed with the IRS. Either the business or the worker may file Form SS-8. If the worker files the form, the IRS will follow up with the firm to get the firm's views as well. IRS will review the facts and circumstances and officially determine the worker's status.
Hi, I'm Tamara, and I work for the IRS. Did you know the IRS has more than 150 videos and archive webinars on numerous topics to help you with various tax issues? It's true, and they all can be found together on the IRS Video Portal. To get to the site, go to irs.gov and type Video Portal into the search box, or go there directly by typing www.irsvideos.gov into your internet browser. You'll find topics conveniently arranged, such as videos for individuals, small businesses, tax professionals, and more. And if you're interested in watching webinars like this one, which have been previously broadcasted, click the All Webinars tab. You won't be able to get CPE credit by watching the archive version, but you will get helpful information. The most popular feature on the video portal is our Small Business Workshop, which so far has been viewed 200,000 times. You might also want to check out Your Guide to an IRS Audit, which can hopefully take the fear of an audit by letting people know what to expect and what their rights are during an IRS audit. Again, you can get to the video portal by going to irs.gov and typing Video Portal into the search box.
By now, I am sure you are asking yourself, what are my employment tax obligations? Once a determination on whether the worker is an employee or independent contractor is made, whether by your business or by the IRS, the next step is filing the appropriate forms and paying the associated taxes. Information on reporting payments to employees is available in Publication 15, Circular E, the Employer's Tax Guide. The remainder of this presentation will address reporting requirements for payments to independent contractors. Forms 1099 may be required for other types of payments as well. Information on other types of payments that may require a 1099 can be found on irs.gov. There are many kinds of Form 1099, but for this presentation I will be exclusively talking about Form 1099 MISC. Form 1099 MISC is most commonly used by payers to report the payments made in the course of a trade or business to others for services. If you paid someone who is not your employee, such as a subcontractor, an attorney, or an accountant, $600 or more for services provided during the year, the payment might need to be reported on a Form 1099. You must provide Form 1099 to the independent contractor by January 31st of the year following the payment. You must also send a copy of this form to the IRS by February 28th, although the form does not have to be filed with the IRS until March 31st if your business files their 1099s electronically. You may have to file Form 1099 to report payments for services performed for your trade or business if the following four conditions are met. 1, you made the payment to someone who is not your employee. 2, you made the payment for services in the course of your trade or business, including government agencies and nonprofit organizations. 3, you made the payment to an individual, a partnership, estate, or in some cases a corporation. And 4, you made payments to the payee of at least $600 during the year. Generally, you report a payment as a non-employee compensation. Payments for services to corporations generally are not required to be reported on Form 1099 unless those payments were for legal or medical services. However, payments for services to partnerships are required to be reported on Form 1099. A common mistake is failing to issue Form 1099 to a limited liability company, or LLC. An LLC is a business structure allowed by state statute. Depending upon elections made by the LLC and the number of members, the IRS will treat an LLC as either a corporation, a partnership, or as part of the LLC's owner's tax return. Payments for services to LLCs must be reported on Forms 1099 unless the payee has elected to be treated as a corporation for federal tax purposes. It's important to properly complete Form 1099 in order to avoid backup withholding and penalties, which will be discussed later. Be sure to complete the payer's, that's your name and address, the payer's federal identification number, the recipient's identification number, the recipient's name and address, and, in Box 7, the amount paid to the independent contractor. Your business is only required to secure the payee's TIN when the payment becomes a reportable payment. That is, generally, when the total payments in a calendar year exceeds $600. Form W-9, Request for Taxpayer Identification Number and Certification, can be used to request the correct name and TIN of the payee, but it's not required at this point. A TIN may be either a Social Security number, or an SSN, or an Employer Identification Number, or EIN. You can secure the payee's TIN in any manner, written or orally. If you do secure the payee's TIN using Form W-9, keep the Form W-9 in your files for 4 years, for future reference and in case of any questions from the payee or from the IRS. What should you do if a payee doesn't provide or refuses to provide you their TIN? You, as the payer, should initiate backup withholding. What is backup withholding, you might ask? Under the provisions of Internal Revenue Code Section 3406B, persons making certain payments to payees must withhold and pay to the IRS a specified percentage of those payments under certain conditions, including payments to independent contractors. Publication 15 includes a listing of other types of payments that may be subject to backup withholding. Backup withholding is also applicable if a payee provides you with an obviously incorrect TIN. An obviously incorrect TIN is one that contains more or less than 9 digits or contains alpha characters, say letters. If a payee does not provide you with his or her TIN, you, as the payer, are required to withhold 28% from the payment as backup withholding. If the IRS discovers that you, the payer, did not withhold the required backup withholding, you can be held liable. You report backup withholding on Form 945, Annual Return of Withheld Federal Income Tax. For more information, including the deposit requirements for Form 945, see the instructions for Form 945 or Publication 15. When the IRS receives Forms 1099, the IRS matches the name and TIN for verification purposes. The IRS may send you a CP2100 or CP2100A backup withholding notice if the payee's TIN is missing or obviously incorrect, or the payee's TIN doesn't match the payee's name. The CP2100 will include a list of payees with missing TINs and payees whose TIN and name do not match. What do you do if you receive a CP2100 or CP2100A notice. The first step is to compare the listing with your records. The error could be an oversight or an error in your own records. If this is what happened, the only thing you should do is correct your records and update them. For missing or obviously incorrect TINs, determine if you are already backup withholding on payments made to that payee. If you are not, begin backup withholding immediately. You must also make up to 3 solicitations for the TIN: initial, first annual, second annual, to avoid a penalty for failing to include a TIN on the information return. For incorrect TINs, compare the accounts on the listing with your business records. If they agree, send the appropriate B notice to the payee. A B notice is a letter to the payee asking the payee to verify his or her TIN. The specific documentation the payee must provide will depend on whether this is the first time the payee appeared on a CP2100 list. Specific instructions are included on the CP2100 notice. Generally, you should begin backup withholding if a payee fails to respond to a B notice within 30 days. It's important to backup withhold when required and follow the instructions on the CP2100 notice. If you don't, you, the payer, may be held liable for any backup withholding that was required. In addition to backup withholding, a payer may also be subject to penalties for failure to file a correct information return if information is missing or incorrect, or a payer fails to issue a required Form 1099. The penalty for failure to file a correct Form 1099 is $100 per Form 1099. There is also a $100 penalty for failure to furnish Form 1099 to the payee. Now, this concludes the video portion of our webinar, and we thank you for watching. If you would like to submit a question, select the Ask a Question link under the PowerPoint window, and then click Submit. But before we begin, let's discuss a few answers to some frequently asked questions regarding payments to independent contractors. Question 1. Can a sole proprietor have an SSN, or does he or she need an EIN? A sole proprietor may have an SSN or an EIN. However, he or she must always furnish his or her individual name on name line 1, regardless of whether he or she uses an SSN or an EIN. A sole proprietor may also provide a business name, doing business as, a DBA, on name line 2, but he or she must list his or her individual name first on the account with you. Question 2. Are payments to limited liability companies, LLCs, required to be reported on Forms 1099? Payments for services to LLCs must be reported on Forms 1099 unless the payee has elected to be treated as a corporation for federal tax purposes. Question 3. Is an individual ITIN considered a valid TIN for purposes of filing Form 1099? Am I required to backup withhold if a payee provides an ITIN? First, an ITIN is considered a valid TIN for purposes of filing Form 1099. Backup withholding is not required if a payee provides an ITIN unless you're notified by the IRS on a CP2100 notice that the name and ITIN don't match. Now let's begin the Q&A segment. Ed and I will respond to your questions.
Hi, I'm Jerry Kelly Brenner with the Small Business and Self-Employed Division, and I'll be the moderator for the live Q&A portion of the broadcast. We hope you found today's webinar helpful and informative. Remember, if you have any questions related to the topics addressed in today's webinar, please type them in the Ask Question text box and click Submit. Now, we are very fortunate to have joining us today Joe Tiberio, who is a senior manager, and Ed Hutzman, who is a policy analyst. Both are in specialty programs with a focus on employment tax. Welcome, Joe and Ed.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. Hi, how are you? We've received a lot of questions, so let's go ahead and get started. Joe, the first one is for you, and I believe you covered a little bit about this during your frequently asked questions portion of the webinar, but it has to do with non-resident aliens, and maybe you can expand on it a little bit more. Should I back up withhold on a payee who is a non-resident alien?
Yes, Jerry. This is Joe. And the question, we did touch on it a little bit during the video portion of the webinar, but I'll expand on it just to say that, yes, a non-resident alien is subject to backup withholding unless you have a signed form W8BEN, which is the Certificate of Foreign Status of Beneficial Owner for United States tax withholding, and you would have that on file for the payee, the non-resident alien that you made payments to.
I'm sorry, Joe, did you say W8B as in boy, E-N as in Nancy?
Yeah, it's W8B as in boy, Ed as in Edward, N as in Nancy, so it's Ben.
Perfect.
W8
I appreciate
Ben.
it.
And that's short for beneficial owner.
Oh, okay. That's very helpful. Thanks very much.
Mm-hmm.
Ed, the next one is for you, and it has to do with receiving notices for incorrect name and taxpayer identification number matching. What should I do if the first CP2100 notification and the Form W9 is returned with the same incorrect information?
That's a great question. Now, when a business gets a CP2100 and they request a Form W9 from the payee, all they're required to do is keep that W-9 on file. So even if it has the same incorrect information, they are not required to back up withhold. They just need to keep that for future reference in case they get a second CP2100 notice.
And they don't need to file the W-9 form?
They do not. Form W-9s are not filed. They're retained by the business.
Great. So just for recordation purposes, perfect. Thank you. Joe, the next one has to do with partnerships. Are payments to a partnership required to be reported on Form 1099?
Yes, Jerry. The payments made in the course of a trade or business for services, payments made to partnerships for services rendered are required to be reported on a Form 1099. And as I mentioned in the webinar a little while ago, those would be on a 1099 MISC, which is the miscellaneous form.
Great. Thanks for clarifying that. Ed, here's one for you about requesting abatements for backup withholding. If I receive an assessment for backup withholding, can I get an abatement?
Yes, if a business is under audit and they receive an assessment for backup withholding, that business can request relief from the backup withholding, and they would do that by securing a Forms 4669, which are statements of payments received from the payees, and they would also prepare Form 4670, which is prepared by the business, and they would give those to the examiner, and if those are all properly completed, they would receive an abatement on a audit assessment. In addition, they can also submit those forms after the audits. If they had already received an assessment, they can submit those forms along with the Form 945X and request an abatement from the campus where they normally file their tax returns.
Okay, so forms 4669, 4670, and then the last form you mentioned was 945X?
That's correct.
Okay, always good to keep form numbers correct.
Yeah. But one thing I would like to add to that is that if there were any penalties associated with the backup withholding assessment, those would not be abated even if the tax is abated. So the penalties would still be applicable.
Okay, so the tax could be abated but not the penalties.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Joe, here's one having to do with real property. Are 1099s required from rental of real property when no personal services are rendered?
Yes, Jerry. The payments made in the course of a trade or business or rent, and these are reportable payments we're talking about, so the aggregate paid in a given year is over $600. Those would be reportable on a Form 1099 miscellaneous. So, for example, a business who rents office space to run their business. If that's it's a reportable payment. If it's made to a partnership or a trust or someone who's liable for that information reporting, a 1099 would be required. And again, that's when the amounts exceed $600 in a given year.
So if a business is renting a space to run their business out of, are you saying that they should be giving the 1099 to the landlord or the property manager? Is that what you're telling me?
Correct. They should establish if the landlord is or whoever is managing the property and they're making payments to is a corporation or a partnership, an LLC, et cetera. If these are reportable payments, then yes, they would be issuing a Form 1099 miscellaneous.
I bet a lot of small business owners don't know that. They're probably just paying. But it's true, though, because, of course, they want to be able to take that as a deduction for rent on their return. And, of course, we want to make sure that the landlord is including it as income on their return.
And that's different than, say, an individual, say, for example, if you or I rent we pay rent for an apartment that we live in, personal, residence, that would not be a reportable payment. I want to stress that these are made in the course of a trade or business as opposed to something that's personal in nature.
Thanks for the clarification on that, Joe. Okay. Ed, goodness, this one probably should have been the very first question I asked. When is the 1099 miscellaneous and the 1096 due to the IRS?
The 1099 and the 1096 are due to the IRS. There's actually two different dates depending upon whether the business files them on paper or files them electronically. If they file on paper, the forms are due to the IRS by the last day of February 28th or the 29th in a leap year. And if they file electronically, they're due by March 31st.
So there's a benefit to them if they file electronically.
Yes, and in certain cases, if they file more than 250 information returns, they're required to file electronically. So there are certain requirements that they can go to irs.gov to determine whether they're required to file electronically.
Great, thanks. Joe, can a worker use his I-10 on an SS-8?
So earlier when I was talking, I think toward the beginning of the presentation, we were talking about the importance of determining whether payments you make to an individual are in the course, payments made to an individual in the course of your trade or business are either wages paid to an employee or payments made to an independent contractor. And I mentioned, I think at that time, that Form SS-8, which is the determination of worker status for purposes of federal employment taxes and income tax withholding, is a good way to try to help you understand whether the payments you're making to that individual are wages or independent contractor payments. And so when if you've seen the Form SS-8, Jerry, you'll know it's essentially a 4-page questionnaire which asks all kinds of questions about the relationship between the two parties, whether the payer retains the right to direct and control the worker, not only in what they're doing, but in not only the manner of the work, but in how it's getting done. So that form is filed with with the SS-8 determination unit at IRS, and they will make a determination as to whether the worker is an employee or independent contractor. And so with that, they ask for identifying information for the worker, and that could include their name, their address, their identification number, and that can be a Social Security number, an I-10. It can be whatever identifying number is available can be submitted on that form. And there is the SS8 determination unit with an IRS will correspond with the business and with the worker. And so during the course of that correspondence, if there's additional information needed to identify either of the two parties, whether it be a clarification on the tax identification number, et cetera, then that, that'll be requested at that time. But the initial filing, yes, it would be acceptable to have not only the name and address and such, but an ITIN or an SSN.
It's interesting that you mention about the SS8 being a questionnaire. I've actually talked with some tax practitioners who have said that they've used it for just that particular reason, not necessarily to file it, but just to use it as a questionnaire and show it to their clients who are small business owners, and they're able to determine oftentimes just by going through those questions whether someone is an independent contractor or an employee.
No, it's interesting to hear you say that, Jerry, because I think it is a really good tool, whether it actually ever gets filed with IRS or not, even just to use it for your own purposes to try to get to some of the key questions as to, what you need to consider when you're establishing a relationship with a person that you're working with. And so, yeah, it's available on irs.gov. You can download it, you can print it, and again, kind of work through the questions, and you may, be able to satisfy your own judgment of whether this is an employment relationship or not. Of course, if you determine that you want to submit it, again, IRS will correspond with the business as well as with the worker and gather more information in an attempt to get the correct determination out there.
Great. So it can be used either way. That's terrific. Sure. Thanks so much. Ed, this one has to do with a single member LLC and using an EIN or a Social Security number. I am a single member LLC reporting my business on Form 1040, Schedule C. Do I use my business's EIN or my personal Social Security number on the Form 1099 miscellaneous in the payer section?
When a business fills out Form 1099 for the payer information, they should use the name and the EIN of the business. So a single member LLC should use the EIN of the LLC. Just to expand a little bit upon that, if you are just a sole proprietor, and report your business on a 1040 Schedule C, and you do have reportable payments and are required to file Forms 1099, you would be required to get a EIN for that business in order to file the 1099. So really for any payer that issues a 1099, they should have an EIN.
So many businesses think, oh, well, I'm just like a sole proprietor. I don't really need an EIN, but these days, too, it's sad to say, especially with identity theft, that really getting an EIN for their business is probably a really good way to go, even over and above all of the filing requirements that they may have.
Yes, that is a good way to be sure to try to avoid some identity theft, and also, there are certain times that a business is required to have one, so they can request the EIN by submitting an SS4, and there's information on irs.gov which will tell them when they are required to have an EIN if they're not sure.
Right, and there's even actually an online interactive tool to be able to get an EIN for the majority of small businesses, so that's a good place to go as well.
Yes, they can do that right online. They don't have to actually fill out any paperwork. They can do it right online and get the EIN assigned to them.
Yeah, get it signed right away.
Yeah.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Ed. Joe, having to do with W-9s, must businesses get a new W-9 each year if the contract services extends beyond the first year?
No, the Form W-9, which is used to secure the taxpayer identification number of whomever you're paying, really is kind of a good foundation to get you started on proper information reporting, because now you'll have, not only the name and address and taxpayer identification number of the payee, so when you're ready to issue your 1099s, you'll have all that information on file. You're not required to secure a new W-9 each year. In many cases, businesses will make payments to, will work with the same contractors or consultants year after year. As long as that party's information doesn't change, if they don't have maybe create a new organization where they have a new number and a new name or a new address, then really the information that's gathered on the initial Form W-9 is satisfactory. So yeah, there's no specific requirement to getting. It's, I guess, kind of similar to a W-4 that you would use for an employee. That really isn't a requirement, although there are some exceptions to that. But in this case, the first W-9 you get is good as long as nothing's changed with the payee.
And can you specify again, Joe, when they should be securing the W-9s?
Well, the W-9 should be secured really when you first begin making payments to a new vendor, a new contractor, a consultant. If you're making reportable payments in the course of your trade of business and you expect that you're going to have to issue a Form 1099 miscellaneous to this individual, really I think that you're at risk if you wait until after, toward the end of the year or something like that, because then you may be in a situation where you don't have the information necessary for reporting. So I would say as soon as you've begun the relationship and you've made that first payment, especially once your aggregate payments are over $600, then at that point you certainly will need a W-9.
Well, it seems like a practical thing to do right from the get-go, from the relationship, to just establish that, to know you have it, because hopefully you'll have an ongoing business relationship, and maybe your first payment is only $300, but then you'll possibly have another reason to use the services, and it could be over $600. A little late to ask for it then, and someone say, no, I'm not going to give you that information, and then it's like, okay, well then give me some of the money back so I can send it to the IRS.
Yeah, you're right. It's a good practice to get into. I think it's kind of like one of those good habits to start with. Although again, so yeah, I think that again, that's to me, if you're really to kind of be your own advocate in this case, I would suggest securing the W-9 as soon as possible.
Thank you. And we have time for one more question today. CP2100 or CP2100A notice will be received by the payer or the payee or both. Apparently the PowerPoint presentation indicates the payee. So they want a clarification.
I apologize if the PowerPoint presentation wasn't clear. The CP2100 notice is sent to the payer. So it's the business that filed the Forms 1099 is the one that would receive the CP2100 notice that would show if there were any payee statements, Forms 1099, where the name and the TIN of the payee didn't match or the TIN was missing. So the payer is the business that receives the CP2100 notice. Included with the CP2100 notice is a form letter, what we call a B notice, B as in boy, which is language that the payer can use to prepare a letter to send to the payee to solicit the correct information that they should have for the payee's name and TIN.
Okay, so thank you for clarifying that.
Jerry, could I expand on one point that I
please do, yes.
About the B notice? I think it's been mentioned. I think it was mentioned earlier, but the publication 1281 is available on IRS.gov, and it's got just a wealth of information about this entire process, the B notice process, the CP2100. It's set up in a nice question and answer format, so it's fairly easy to work through. Although there's a lot of information, so it may be more than the average person needs, but someone who's in a situation where they either have to start back up withholding or they receive a CP2100 and need to issue B notices, that publication 1281 will be invaluable to them.
Publication 1281, great. Yes. I'm sure a lot of people didn't know about that publication before now. Before we close the Q&A session, Joe, what are the most important points that you want the attendees to remember from today's webinar?
Well, there's a couple things, Jerry, and I'll mention a couple, then Ed, I'll ask you to jump in and add your thoughts as well. I think probably one of the most important things, I think, is making sure that you know whether workers you hire are employees or independent contractors. If it's a situation where it's not really clear and you're not sure based on the relationship that you're entering, the IRS can help with that determination. We mentioned it earlier. The Form SS8 is available, as you mentioned, Jerry, as kind of a self-help tool, or to prepare and actually submit to the IRS, and we'll help you make that correct determination. So that's really important to know right up front. The individuals that you're paying, whether they really should be considered your employees or whether they're actually independent contractors. The other things really are, be sure to file any required Forms 1099 to independent contractors. You file those with IRS and furnish them to the payee. So make sure that those individuals who you've paid receive their 1099 miscellaneous, so that that will help them stay in compliance with their tax return. And Ed, I guess maybe I'll just ask you, did you want to add anything else beyond those 2 points?
Sure. Those are really 2 very important points. Some other things that I think businesses should be aware of, and you talked a little bit about this, was in your questions, was securing the independent contractors or the payees TIN before you make reportable payments. It's important to make sure that you secure that TIN before the payment's made, or else backup withholding could be an issue that could come up later on, or you'd be required to backup withhold. So if a payee fails to provide their TIN before you make the reportable payments, be sure to backup withhold. This way, if you backup withhold, that money is paid over, and there will be no future assessment against the business. They wouldn't be liable separate for it because it would already have been paid. So, again, so be sure to secure the TIN. Another area that we often see problems with are payments to LLCs, and again, it was addressed in the webinar and in the Q&As that we were talking about. Remember, an LLC stands for a limited liability company. An LLC is not automatically considered a corporation unless they elected to be so. So if you're paying a company that's designated as an LLC, be sure to get a W-9 so you know what type of entity it is, whether it's a corporation, a partnership, or sole proprietorship, so you know whether a Form 1099 is required to be filed for payments to the LLC. And the last thing has to do with the CP2100 notice. It's very important that, when a business receives a CP2100 notice, that they don't ignore it, that it has a lot of instructions in there as to what a business should do to secure the proper TINs for the employees, for the payees, and by following those instructions, the business can certainly limit their potential liability for backup withholding in the event there's any further checks on whether they complied with the requirements of the CP2100.
Well, thanks, Joe and Ed. Well, that's all the time we have for questions today. We hope you learned a few things about hiring and paying independent contractors, as well as the important related filing requirements. For access to the resources referred to during this broadcast, visit irs.gov at www.irs.gov and use keywords pay independent contractors. Under the Reporting Payments to Independent Contractors link, you'll find valuable information and guidance, plus the designated phone number for the information reporting call site. In case you would like to review this information again or refer someone who was not available to view the webinar today, It will be posted in approximately 3 weeks in the IRS Video Portal at www.irs, V as in Victor, I, D as in David, E, O, S as in Sam, .gov. Thanks for watching our webinar. Much success to you and your business, and we hope you have a great day.